Hello, we are welcoming you all on the last panel of this meeting of Filozofikon 2. I'm joined with Sven Dwulecki, University of Tübingen, and Krzysztof from Jagiellonian University. The gentlemen are also cooperating on Facta Ficta Research Center. Together we will be talking about philosophy of computer games. So to start off, maybe you, Krzysztof, please tell me, what does philosopher can learn from computer game?
I think that everything, basically, because of the fact that in order to video games to be realized, we need to establish a certain framework, which is usually a virtual world or a virtual space, or a fictional word, or a narrative word, generally a word. So it's basically the start of two possible huge philosophical discussions, one being ontological, and we may ponder whether the word is real or not real, whether it is metaphysical or physical, and so, and epistemological. So we may ponder on how we can learn about the word, or how can we try to reason what is true and what is not, what is fictional, what is factual, and so on and so forth. So these are two great strands in the history of philosophy, and I think that video games are establishing a quite decent framework for such studies.
Okay, thank you. So can you share your thoughts on this, Sven? Just generally, what can philosopher learn from video game, according to you?
I think that's a really complicated issue because it depends.
I hope so.
I hope so too. Otherwise, our PhD projects might be way too early finished. So basically, I think the issue with video games is they are highly diverse, highly complex, and it depends which type of game you're looking at. So if you're looking, for example, at an economy simulator like Tropico, and you play a dictator, I think it shows very specific how different aspects of society play into a dictatorship. So in Tropico, for lots of time, it was the case that if you played a religious dictator, it was very easy because people were pleased despite living in poverty. And so as a means of simulation, it might be interesting for a philosopher to see how other people perceive certain aspects of society to play into certain aspects. The question is, I guess, what philosophy is trying to accomplish by looking at video games. Is it the meaning making of a player, or is it the game producing meaning for the players?
Okay. So following you, Sven, maybe please tell me, to reverse this question, what does philosopher can, or philosophy can bring, or how can philosophy contribute to gaming industry? Is it possible to for philosopher to contribute?
Well, being a rhetorician, that doesn't really make me, I think, an expert to answer if a philosopher would be a good and a wise choice. But I could say it that way. The philosophical faculties and their way of looking at the world are very distinct from all those other possibilities out there. So we have tremendous designers and tremendous artists who make those gorgeous games and fun games. But the biggest advantage I see from a rhetorical point of view and a philosophical point of view, and basically everything, even sociology, and you cannot name all those disciplines, and all of them have a unique perspective. Yeah. And the good thing, and I think that also, for example, includes theology, they give purpose to the game. Game is fun, that's cool, and that's why we play them. But if it should be more than that, if it should become an art, become something meaningful, something that really revolutionizes our world, it requires philosophers and people of that type of thinking, because then we have journey, and you play and you reflect about your life, and it's not complicated. You don't need lots of text, no cutscenes. The only thing you need is a strong concept and a vision to follow through. And obviously someone interpreting on it, and I think philosophy and all of us who delve deeply into the meaning of games can deliver that additional layer that might be missed by many people.
Okay, thank you. And what do you think, Krzysztof?
As a follow-up, a fellow researcher, Michał Kłosiński, whom we all miss, regarding the fact that he studies hermeneutics of video games and has contributed a variety of articles to the philosophy of computer games in general, said once to me that the success of The Witcher was not determined by the good writing, the good producing, and good game design, of course, also. But the thing was that it was generally produced by cultural studies graduates, literary studies graduates, philosophical studies graduates, and so on and so forth. So not by the author himself, not necessarily by the game designers.
At the time was a philosopher. I just wanted to remind.
Yeah, but generally, it's the fact that video game is a product of an incredibly focused effort of many people and huge teams, and it can be, of course, a fruit of masterminds' work, as Sven usually calls it, but it's also a dedicated work of a team. And so, necessarily, those people come from different societies, different disciplines, different research disciplines, and different research areas. And usually, philosophers and cultural studies researchers have the capacity to understand this variety of things that they need to face while creating not only a video game but also the world that makes this video game replayable.
Okay, so the thing that ponders me is whether the computer games as a new form of medium or a new form of art have a potential to shape the world or to change, as, for example, writers like McGonigal propose. Does a game propose something different or something better or maybe better suited to modern times that could potentially be beneficial to not only as a mean of entertainment, but maybe something socially beneficial? What do you guys think?
You start. Redirection.
Okay, if you think so. So yeah, we heard an awful lot of talks during this conference about different aspects of video games, and I think every single one of them has one in common. If you look at video games, it's not just the play. It has a meaning to a certain degree. Either we talked earlier about the importance of JRPGs and how it perpetuates friendship, how it wants to show, I think it's in Persona 3 where they say, 2 in harmony surpass 1 in perfection. And it's not only expressed through words and through the narrative, but also through the gameplay. That it's not the one person who is super adaptable and who's played by the individual player. No, it's the group. It's always a group of 3, 4 people working together, going through the dungeon, making a difference in the smallest scale. And if you look at games in a general sphere, I would say it really depends on the individual case, because, for example, I earlier mentioned Journey, but I could also say Virginia, The Unfinished Swan, Gone Home. But also, and I'm totally serious about that, I think equally much so Tomb Raider, Uncharted, or Metal Gear Solid make a tremendous difference because they make us think about certain aspects of our world. So I personally can say I played every Metal Gear Solid game with huge passion, and every single time when I finished the game, I was sitting there and started contemplating about certain aspects of it. Metal Gear Solid 2, for example, predicted the entire prison program many, many years before it became public. Metal Gear Solid 4 basically warned us about issues with Blackwater. So what happens if we privatize armies too heavily? And Metal Gear Solid 1 and the series overall always makes one huge stance. Nuclear weapons are potentially the downfall of mankind, even if we nowadays do not think so often about it. Okay, obviously due to Trump and Putin, it changes lately, but still, we're not, thank God, not living in the Cold War anymore. But that doesn't mean that the means of destruction are not still at our disposal, and those games advocate for being cautious and making a political stance. and that makes it, in my eyes, equal to movies and books and all other media that have similar agendas.
It is all the more emphasized by the fact that genres that are encountered in books usually reiterate across other media, movies included, comic books included, and so on and so forth. But of course, and predominantly I do think, video games, which are, as a fresh medium, can bring much new to both franchises and to genres. The basic and my favorite example are dystopias, because in case of games like Remember Me, which has one of the most dreadful gameplays and game mechanics encounterable in the industry, still brings up certain important subjects about the control of corporations, about the problem of imposing control over civilians, of course under a disguise of bringing help to them, and of course shaping a brave new world. So it would be a shame to judge such a game as Remember Me only by its dreadful gameplay, because what it brings are those philosophical concepts and problems, which is why, of course, a majority of players watched Remember Me as a gameplay on YouTube, just not to bother themselves with struggling through all those levels. But it's also the case of such accomplished titles and well-esteemed as BioShock Infinite, which was criticized for the dissonance between the narrative and exploration-oriented achievements, like, for instance, the fact that we can hear about the history of this world and the backstory only from those collectible items. So that's where the narrative is hidden. And of course, finding those items or hunting for them in the world where only shooting matters, accurately of course, is incredibly difficult. I remember myself struggling to hear what is going on and what is recorded in its voxophone while shooting as enemies that were swarming in the city. So what I think is that those questions that are brought by philosophy and so on and so forth usually can prove let's say, in commas, quality of the medium. So it's not only about gameplay, it's not only about a ludic experience, it's not only also about the narrative, but it can be also about our cognition, about the way we perceive the world, and how we believe in those in the way we can solve universal problems in the virtual environment.
You see, computer games as a medium is like ultimate fusion of different arts. You have their movie, theater, architecture, painting, you name others, right? So we have to develop, I think, different aesthetics and different, maybe exactly hermeneutic tools to understand and research this medium. What is the future of the researchers in this area? How do you guys see it?
Well, considering how young we are as a distinct and independent research field, and considering that it's just a very short time where the basics has been laid down, well, basically everything is still open. We have so many things still to address, considering we just started talking about rhetoric. We have one major book, and that's it. And many people commenting on it, yes, but we don't even have one big counter-theory to it. That really shows how early on we are in the research field. Then we have many people considering already the question of production, but mainly this comes from the industry, which is definitely a good thing. It's always good if those who produce it also give a comments on that worked, that didn't, and that's why it happened. And I think we all agree upon the fact that it's better if academia and business cooperates. And so this is a great start. But I think there are two major things that are coming in the upcoming years that are important. A, that society understands the importance. Very often you hear this statistic that the video game industry makes more money than music and box office sales of cinema products. Yes, but also nobody says that the majority of movies and series don't produce their money through box office, but for merchandise, for the DVDs, for the streaming rights. And so games are not medium number one, because if they would be, then there would be also already far more pressure from the economy to make it equal on many, many levels. This is not the case. We're still working on that. And I think we will achieve that point because, as you said, this mixture is very interesting, and there's no other medium I'm aware of that can adapt so easily to the user. Just think about it. You can play on easy mode, on story mode if you don't like having complicated gameplay, but you can also say, hey, I like the challenge. I want to have hard mode, super hard mode, and brutal, and that's amazing. So the first thing is societal acknowledgement. And the second thing, and I think that is almost more important because it will determine how we will develop as a whole, is that both sides, academia and business, understand that we need each other. Working 1 year within the industry and having worked with some of the most talented people in this field, I can say those guys know their stuff. They are unbelievably talented. They can do literally create worlds out of nothingness. It's marvelous. The one and only issue is it also requires a certain factor of inconvenience, something that is, we have this idea of economy of destruction, or a destructive economy, where somebody is coming in and makes a difference and suddenly the entire system has to recover itself. The game industry had this just twice so far, with two big crises, the Atari crisis and the crisis of 2008, and we are not really well prepared for it. We still haven't recovered. The games are still not selling as well as in the PlayStation 2 era, at least by absolute numbers of consumers. So academia will be important to give them insights and directions and ideas and saying, hey, you know what, that's awesome, but other things suck. And let's work on this and make it better and make video games not great again, but even greater than they are right now.
Oh, that's a very complicated issue because from strictly academic perspective, because I haven't worked in the industry, I can say that there is a great deal of concern regarding the interdisciplinarity. Even currently with let's say, declared openness towards old media such as paintings or traditional art or music, it's sometimes difficult on more traditional faculties to convince that a comparative perspective is needed, not to mention video games, which suffer from their very best quality, which is their openness, because the video games allows to display the players the overall beauty and evil of the mankind. Speaking very metaphorically, they can be literally bastards who will destroy the world, or on the contrary, they can display their virtues. And so we cannot criticize the genre for the very fact that it provides such a space where we can enact ourselves. So the main problem and concern, at least from this very perspective, is the fact that the academia hasn't even acknowledged the performative power of classical tabletop RPGs, which are still concerned as a nerdy business and a strange phenomenon. So even though they were proved to provide, for instance, security for people who otherwise would have felt insecure, because they could act as someone entirely different in the world they love. And video games operate on a very similar premise. They also allow us to cooperate with the world we are fond of, also require a certain degree of knowledge, also produce some lore that we can become familiar with, and of course provide, aside of the linear gameplay and the linear storytelling, also this certain degree of openness. Of course, it can be smaller, like in case of, say, Unfinished Swan already mentioned. Obviously, and gamer versus designer activity would be to spit those black dots everywhere, just everywhere, to cover everything with ink, because that's counterintuitive. What is intuitive is to focalize our perspective, but still, it allows us for this kind of freedom, which is rather unexpected in literature, although it may happen. It's rather unexpected in the cinema. There were actually experiments allowing people gathered in the cinema to decide whether they want a protagonist or movie characters to turn right or turn left in a horror movie, because that was basically what we always wanted. These stupid morons are getting the wrong way. They should go that way because there are monsters lingering in the dark. So when they allowed this kind of freedom, it turned out obviously that the movie can respond and place monsters in a different direction. So every time in any kind of narrative or diegetic space, such freedom can be achieved, but video games were the first to spot this very thing. So definitely industry, as Sven mentioned, should work with academia, but I think that the more concerning aspect is the fact that academia may not always want to work with industry, especially within the humanities. Because humanities tend to be, especially nowadays in the times of the critique of neoliberalism and so on and so forth, kind of suspicious towards the industry and not acknowledging the fact that, for instance, books also should be sold, movies also should be sold, and so on and so forth, just like any other media. The main problem we may address is the fact that companies shouldn't, for instance, enforce those fake DLCs that are a part of the original gameplay, just like it was with XCOM. And I think that was the first DLC to XCOM Enemy Within, which clearly filled the narrative gaps in the first game, and it felt like being cut off in the post-production. So it shouldn't be done. And of course, academia or people from within the academia or game critics as well are those who should intervene on such occasions. And as the last thing, I would like to mention the fact that game critics are actually way more erudite than literary critics nowadays. Although we do not speak about game criticism, for me it's unbelievable that an average YouTube user can watch 40 minutes of review done by Angry Joe. Of course, it's meant for entertainment, but also there is a huge deal of great criticism that also might have came from within the academia.
And just to follow up on this, the issue is as long as academia ignores industry, they basically perpetuate the status quo, which means, and I think that applies to almost all companies out there, games are living objects. They are developed, improved, and at some point they stop because they have to move on to the next project because, well, we want to make money, right? And so the question is, what happens with all those old data? Because if we talk about the archaeology of video games, we talk about looking at a game from its infancy to its release. And most academics have no other choice than doing black box research where they take a game, look at it, and start creating hypotheses, how does the game actually work? Most of us can't look into the code. Most of us do not get the access. But this is, and I have to be frank about this, the most stupid thing I've ever heard in the entirety of media studies, that every other discipline looks at how was the movie produced, who was responsible for something. And we have a sole specific discipline, I know about at least, that blatantly ignores that and thinks, yeah, it's fine if we just look at the final product, and then we start bashing because we do not like neoliberalism, we do not like that games have to be sold, we do not want to acknowledge the fact that people need to be paid and that lives depend on this. And it's problematic because if, for example, let's say we take Tomb Raider, and I want to write an anthology about all the Tomb Raider games. Please, dear God, tell me, how shall I do this? I can only look at the final games, but I do not know. Many of us know nowadays through interviews that Lara wasn't conceptualized as a woman. She was conceptualized as a man with a whip and a hat, and wait. Reminds me of something. Ah, yeah, law. I shouldn't copy another one's work. Maybe we change it. What is the biggest difference we could create from Indiana Jones? Lara Croft. And so the point is, as long as we ignore that there's an industry willing and waiting to cooperate, because they don't want to save files that do not make them money. But if universities say, we pay you a certain amount of money, even if it's a limited one, and buy off all those data and store them, let's say, even for 10 years. In the meantime, this technology is outdated. But when it's unleashed and it's open for research, we can learn everything we want to know, and we are right now just speculating. And honestly making actually fools of ourselves as scientists by basically looking at a magical ball and hoping to know something. Yeah. And this is, at least from my perspective, one of the biggest problems we have to face.
There's also another potential for games and academia, which I see, which is hidden under this term of gamification. So you can gamify education, but there are also several researchers which benefit from basically producing games that tricked using brain power of many people into doing the computer stuff. For example, very great game, which is, by the way, just a good game, is Folded. This is basically a game where you, so to speak, fold proteins. The task which is for computation very, very difficult, but humans, due to evolutionary makeup, just do this very, very simply. It's like a puzzle. It's a good game that gives very solid scientific data on how, through crowdsourcing, right? I don't know if you can use it in this way, the crowdsourcing, but you know what I mean. Builds very solid data. The other thing, I was just checking, remembering what the year was this, but here I have an article from the last year. It's Nature. They built a game to explore the quantum speed limit. The similar way, right? So cultural studies on games can also make academia improve and the researchers and design better experiments. Another thing is, of course, pedagogy, right? I mentioned McGonigal. She has also Mark Prensky is an interesting person here. We can look how games motivate people to do tasks. Because I think we all agree that they do this very, very well, and build maybe better didactics, maybe better pedagogy. I think it's the thing that have to be considered in the future. What do you guys think?
The only thing it should be done as naturally and smoothly as possible. I remember the time during, I think it was like 10 or 12 years ago, when Polish middle school education system was reformed, and there was this idea that we should introduce comparatistics in general, so we will teach people how to compare the text and the painting. And these people actually thought that placing the text from 16th century and contemporary painting will help improving those skills. Of course it didn't, because people just were memorizing the link and not discovering it for themselves. So that's what I'm fearing when every time when I hear that video games will be taught in high schools or they will be introduced there and there, because it of course may be reduced of their complexity. That's my only concern. And about gamification, because the examples you introduced actually are a very fine example of gamification. What I do not like is the fact that even my bank account managing system introduced gamifications, providing me icons and achievements from my purchases. That's against what I expect from such software, of such a website. So it's being used in troublesome ways, of course, but at the very same time it also opens a dangerous path I would not follow. This is the path of so-called serious games, and I always ask this very simple question: what does it mean for a game to be serious? Does it mean that we have unserious games? Of course, it does mean that while playing Skyrim, we cannot infer any serious reasoning out of it, because it is a pure entertainment. Of course, not Papers, Please, because it tells about immigration and so on and so forth, of course. And Skyrim begins with the very act of immigrating to a different frontier. We are immigrants in the land of Skyrim. That's how the narrative starts. So I do not like this schematization of thinking that hides beneath those labels of gamification or serious gaming, because it always operates on a hypothesis that video games equals entertainment, equals fun, equals not working, equals my girlfriend will be mad. So that's a kind of reasoning I think we should oppose, because it labels video games as an unintellectual activity that helps us only escape from true work or from serious reasoning. So aside from that, gamification only proves our point, our commonly shared point, that video games are a vital part of what we do, although of course we must acknowledge that these either serious or gamificated modes of entertainment are not necessarily linked to what I personally like, which is world building. So maybe one exception.
I can't actually say anything better or more than you just did, so thank you.
Okay, so according to what you just said, I think that this distinction on serious games and games that are for fun is just misconception. I think if one would just take time and read the marvelous work by Huizinga, Homo Ludens, and even look at the origins of a play, so to speak. It is such crucial having a game, having a play. It is such a crucial thing for a human to do. It could be compared, and Huizinga does it, to a ritual, for example. In a ritual, you are in a religious ritual. You are fooled in a way, but you know that you are fooled, and you agree that you are being fooled. And this is the clue of this, and that's why ritual work, right? So this is, by the way, maybe another way of immersing yourself in another narrative.
Of course, this idea of agreeing to be fooled was expressed by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his idea of suspending the disbelief, which is the very basis of immersion, and actually also shows that video game studies can, learn much more than it is usually expected from, let's say, classical critical theory or theory of literature, as this problem, serious, not serious, is being currently on and on reiterated in literary criticism, when we frame fantasy and science fiction books as those dedicated for pure entertainment, and the rest, which is never defined, by the way, as something more important. Antoine Compagnon, in his work Demon of Theory, has mocked this idea, saying that in France, in bookstores, we have two shelves. One is labeled fiction, and which is, of course, for pure leisure and entertainment, and another one, literature. And of course, Nobel Prize winners will be on the bookshelf named literature, whereas the fiction elsewhere. I think that it's easily transplantable to video game studies, and how certain researchers would like to pose the question of seriousness of games, because they're thinking in very similar terms, and this thinking hasn't been improved, and that's where the industry should intervene and say, hey, the aforementioned Unfinished Swan or Portal are video games that are never labeled serious, although they bring up very serious questions. For instance, this underlying storyline of Unfinished Swan is basically the work of mourning. This girl or guy, I cannot remember, guy thing, boy, is clearly depressed after his father's death and the abandonment by his mother. So that's the problem. It's a universal problem and it should be addressed, of course. And what is Heisenberg claiming and Hoinziger in his Homo Ludens is basically the very same problem, but also it encourages us to interrelate with different disciplines, and that's why I'm always and constantly emphasizing it, because video game researchers usually try to sever themselves from other disciplines, which is quite reasonable. They just want to establish their own discipline and defend it from high walls, which never works actually. It really never works and leads to such which will always be, I think, ridiculous claims like this hermeneutics, real-time hermeneutics is introduced by Esper and Arset, which has really no sense from the perspective of classical hermeneutics or from philosophical perspective. Of course, there is this sense that is given by Esper and Arset, but it has nothing to do with what philosophy has to say about hermeneutics. For instance, in Heideggerian model, there is this level of inhabitation or real-timeness that Espen Arset is emphasizing. So aside from those trials to just establish our field and to defend it, we should really care about, also from within the industry, to encourage the academia to establish those transdisciplinary links in between.
You want to add something?
Sure. Actually, I was just thinking, if you look at which scientists are right now really having an influence, you realize very quickly there's a difference between who are supposedly very influential and who actually are. So, for example, we have an awful lot of people nowadays who claim procedural rhetoric changed the entire world, and we have now this huge stream of games trying to make a difference by being added to newspapers, and you play the small rhetorical games, and then you want to, I don't know, donate 10 euros to Greenpeace, and in order to do so, you're motivated by a small game. And there are certain companies who do that, who use bogus and think that is a good idea, and it works, yeah. But the issue is those games do not sell on the regular market. And why not? Because what they claim and what they have as a primarily goal is highly specific. It's specific to make you believe a certain standpoint that is extremely tiny. It's a fraction of the entirety of the world. And that's good. That's really great. We need something like that. We need more of that. That's cool. But video games are mass product. So those rhetorical games actually do not reflect that properly. If I talk with many game designers and ask them, hey, what's influencing your work? Then we suddenly start talking about Huizinga, and we start talking about Calois. And those are people who are long, long dead, and they still have an influence. And the point is, why have an influence? Because they give us a distinct feeling what makes game gamey and what makes it fun, and not, well, I want to make a point and I have no audience, so let's make a game because that's what I can do. Without any disrespect for the effort they are doing. The issue is, if you want to influence many people, you need to go the broad way, and that means going AAA titles. And that's something where we're still lacking. We do not make smart suggestions to the industry what to do, which is cost-effective, efficient, and really makes a product more appealing. Because in the end, why should I make a change if I can't see a difference in revenue? I fully understand every CEO saying, right now, I see no effective gain out of a corporation. And this is because of that, because we have this distinct problem that academics want to say it's serious, but that's not what video games are selling.
And the other problem is the fact that I don't want to speak in huge quantifiers, let's say, but some, let's say, independent or serious video games are very single purpose. So they serve to address a single idea, not to change the world, not to change the way we are thinking. They want to address the subject, perfectly one that is trending currently, either in the academia or in the literary criticism or in the game criticism and so on and so forth. That's also the case of some Anita Sarkeesian's works, which only address a certain subject and nitpick at video games. My favorite example are from The Witcher, which is in her reading extremely simplified. And she doesn't read this word as the word, but she only reads certain problems, decontextualize them, and boss around, of course. That's her right, that's game criticism, but what we can see here is this tendency of analyzing single-purpose video games and the threat they are causing later on in the discussion. So what I think is that we should aim at polishing those AAA titles and trying to introduce those subjects that are addressed in the criticism. That's actually way more appealing, and also helps us evade this problematic dilemma that is reiterated in the academic criticism, and I've heard this expression once, and I will be trying to quote it as literary as possible, that certain works are trying to sell out the precious ideas that we once had. And this selling out thing, or commodifying the idea, is a really threatening thesis, because it says that we actually discard some of the universal problems that have been, for instance, argued in literature, and now we are selling it out like I don't know, 1 week potatoes on the market, and it actually diminishes the value of a problem and shows that certain people are prejudiced from the very beginning, not towards the any kind of a problem, but certain medium, that they label video game or fantasy literature as commodifying. Therefore, any kind of universal idea will be commodified when framed within this certain medium. So that's the problem. And I think that that's also another origin for this issue of seriousness.
Well, we can immediately point out to certain titles, like very famous. I don't know if it's EEE or, but it's certainly a very famous game, the Journey, which is game basically about meditation, and the other one, that Dragon Cancer, the last year, I believe, game, which is just wonderful. And those game critics, you were like Angry Joe. I believe there is the critic of this game, because at some point everybody just played the Dragon Cancer. I'm not certain how well does this game sells, but if there is a serious game, I can't imagine better example than this one. But still, there is there are certain narrative and methodological tools used that every game is using there, right? So it's best of the both worlds, maybe.
Yeah, Beyond Two Souls was a great example of a AAA video game, extremely popular, but very moderately received, let's say. So I remember one, I don't know if it was a review or only a response video, but someone uploaded on YouTube a clip that actually fixed Beyond Two Souls by placing all the events in chronological order, which is absolutely counter-intuitive and also the very game logic, which is about remembering things from the past and not placing them chronologically, obviously, because there are other links there. And this video game is, of course, it was also criticized for being rather a movie, but again, that's it could be evaded when we look at it from a transdisciplinary perspective. I may enjoy a video game that is movie-like. I do not necessarily have to perceive any kind of a video game as a Dark Souls challenge, because, for instance, that's the very reason I have never ever, and I will never play Dark Souls, because I know that would end with devastating results from my psychological condition. So I think that what Sven pointed out several sentences ago, that good video games should have certain levels of difficulty and encourage a variety of players to engage and to actually play, because maybe there is also this technological barrier for certain audiences. I may imagine that people who are not accustomed to using Microsoft Word, and believe me, there are many of those, which can be easily seen whenever anyone ever edited a book. I may imagine that they may have problems with video games, so maybe removing some of those cognitive or technological barriers will help them interact with the final product and perceive the medium in a different way. Because of course, books, for instance, due to their accessibility, are better understood, just like movies. Whereas comic books or tabletop RPGs are not, because they are not that easily accessible. For instance, I've learned how to play Magic the Gathering just 2 days ago, and it wasn't easily accessible because I needed to learn some rules and so on and so forth, and learn how the word works and so on and so forth. So that's maybe the problem also.
But what you already alluded to, and I think this is important to stress, is competence. Equally, academics as well as professional need certain competences, understanding our medium, understanding how it works. And I think professionals who produce those games have this competence by nature far, far better and far more developed. And one of the things that is really striking, if you go throughout the entirety of all those books published about video games, and you read those theories and start to think of it, and start realizing, wow, not a single sense of reasonability or ratio in the classical sense. They wrote something, what they felt, and what is maybe theoretically correct, but has nothing to do with reality. And the issue is with philosophy keeps staying in its ivory tower, preying and hawking on an entire industry and saying, yes, see at this point. Look, best example right now, Mass Effect. Look at the terrible, terrible game for not being perfect from the get-go. Well, after working in the industry, I can tell you, the world is not perfect. You have certain criteria to fulfill. You have contracts to oblige to. Sometimes you change one thing in a game and it has ripple effects throughout the entire game you couldn't perceive prior. So, and the same applies, for example, for No Man's Sky. Yes, obviously, those were promises not held, not kept, but were promises, and I hope at least, and I believe it's, made out of good conscience that it was planned to do so and to deliver that. And then life came into play and changed things. So the thing is, I think, yes, we need, in order to answer your question from earlier, we need philosophers, because they can be great critics. But Krzysztof, I think you're perfectly right. We have YouTubers that are far better critics because they have a sense of reality, what is possible and what's feasible, but what both of them lack most of the time is inside knowledge. I would like to see philosophical critics who have either a business degree or at least business experience and can say, hey, I look at the game and I see it has flaws, but I tell you something. Every single game, in my perspective, is what I would usually compare to non-finito art. It's an art of work that's never finished. Due to 2 things. A, nobody has the time to create something that's perfect, because it will take you ages and tons of money, and if you're not an indie who has the passion and the power and the free time to do so, it's almost impossible. And secondly, it's never finished because it requires the player to play it. Meaning, each of us 3 can play the same game, and we have 3 entirely different perspectives because we have different backgrounds. And that's amazing because it gives us different ideas, different insights, new ideas what to do with it. And that's important. But if I already say I just want to do it with one eye closed, because I think the higher ideas, the perfect ideals I want to follow, 2,000 years old, yes, that's great. But it's not moving us forward if we can't make compromises that are actionable. And the point is, in the end, we need to find a common language between both sides. And I highly doubt that if both want to stay on the ground and not move towards each other, this will ever change.
Precisely, especially given the fact that when we read through the majority of the game studies or ludological books, the striking fact is that we will not encounter the games we love, play, and know. We will encounter only some very obsolete, different, strange, nostalgic examples of video games that were played on Commodore and so on and so forth. And what is the point of that? What is the point of building a whole game theory on Mario, where we have Skyrim? That's something that's ununderstandable for me, and that's also the very reason I dislike quoting ludologists and video game critics, because they usually do not say what I'm interested in, and they do not operate on this range of examples. Of course, that's a generalization, I know that, but it's a striking fact that when you read those articles, usually articles or case studies are focused on those better-known examples, but books, hell, they prefer the most simplistic examples because of the very simple reason: illustration. You can easily illustrate an 8-bit video game and place a black and white illustration in the book, but let's ask Bethesda for rights for Dishonored 2 for being published in a scientific scholarly book in 2017. It would be problematic, possibly, or it would be costly. Either way, it's hard to obtain, and I would love researchers to face the problem and say it outwardly. I will be focusing on obsolete elderly games because my publisher cannot afford buying rights for Bethesda's screenshots. That would be a very good claim. But conversely, they are actually falsifying game studies and trying to impose on us the belief that AAA games are worth nothing from the academic perspective, and although the reasons may be very simple. Of course, that's only a hypothesis, but seeing how academic publishers works, gives me some strong and firm belief that this may be a very accurate one. And there is also one problem with this lack of cooperation with the industry, that usually this experience is neglected because, well, some may say that there are literary historians or Polish studies representatives, English studies, and so on and so forth, who never wrote a book or never ever talked with a writer, and still they did their research. And of course, it's extremely unpopular, for instance, amongst literary studies scholars to contact with the writer, which I think it's perfectly good and also important, because it might give some insight to the research, although that's a very unpopular theory, and maybe it's also being adopted to game studies, maybe.
Actually, I would also add to that, considering what we can read right now, which type of books are being handled. Very often, and it's perfectly understandable, I personally do the same, and you too, as I know. We choose games that are interesting to us because we like them, we enjoyed them, and therefore we want to keep playing them and spend more time with them, which is perfectly fine. But most of us lack a distinct methodology of how to tackle their own games and have a certain fanboyism to it that is detrimentous, actually, to the entire research field, because, and I have a limited understanding of philosophy, but I always got the notion that philosophy is interested in finding something similar, at least, to truth, or getting closer to it. And I always wondered, how could it be that we are so young, yet old enough to have everything settled, theoretically, but we have no common standards for quoting games. We have no common standards of making it clear that this is in a game. I see so many times pages and pages of summary of a game, and not a single quote. And if it's YouTube, I don't care. I want to have the visual proof that exists in the game, and it's not created by some hallucinating author sitting there 24 hours in front of a paper because he has a deadline, and I'm not even saying it's done on purpose. I'm saying that we all have our certain constraints, we have certain things to oblige to, it happens, it's human. But the point is, it can be avoided if we have standards. And we have no standards. Nowadays, everybody can say, yeah, I like Mario, I like Lara Croft. And this is considered science. And this is imposterous.
There are conference presentations which are based upon this very premise that a person says that, oh, I like this video game, and starts reiterating truisms about the gameplay and so on and so forth, and of course summaries. And the problem is that from the editorial perspective, establishing a standard for quoting a video game is nearly impossible, because we cannot estimate, we cannot define the time frame. That's the problem, because we can say that it happened in the 43rd minute of our gameplay, but not the average gameplay. So maybe the way of bypassing it is quoting a playthrough on YouTube, but we should have standardized playthroughs. For instance, if a company if companies were informed about the problem, they would have, for instance, came up with an idea of issuing, let's say, approved gameplays of video games and placing them in a database that could be accessed by academics, because obviously not on YouTube, that way it would be available for everyone, and of course affecting their sales and so on and so forth. But such an standardized gameplay could solve the problem. I remember my own problems when I tried to quote BioShock Infinite, and fortunately, I wanted to quote those cinematics that appeared with these stylized for the 20s, and also Voxofon transcriptions. The latter I found on a wiki dedicated to BioShock Infinite, so it could be bypassed. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we want to quote a dialogue, and there are no transcripts. By the way, it's the same problem in movie studies, but there is one major advantage: there are DVDs. And generally, if we even watch a movie in a let's say unsecure on an unsecure website, there are no differences in time between the let's say official version of the movie and unofficial one. So it can be quoted. In case of a video game, it can't. And it tells, I think that Sven's point is great, because it tells us in a nutshell what is the problem. The problem is that the academia, despite all of statements, doesn't want to appreciate the fact that video games are a vital source of study, and that they should be referenced in the research. When we do not have the tools for referencing, it's no wonder that people are summarizing. Basically, most of articles that are submitted to more general theoretical journals need to have this also rhetorical feature. How to convince this professor who is sitting in the research board that from the first glance that this is a vital research, that I'm not talking about some dreamy lands and my boys' fantasies. That's the problem. So half of the paper in that way is dedicated to proving that I'm not an apple. And later on we may focus on those things that make our research significant. So at the very first start we are halfway, in a way, discriminated. Halfway through our paper, because we just need to prove the obvious point.
And on top of that, we have so many tools provided by the industry so far. We have trophy systems. We have officially made statistics. For example, if somebody of you is playing recently Resident Evil 7, they publish an awful lot of information about gameplay behavior. Like, if you played the game, you will know why it's important. Over 2/3 of all players leave the doors open, which is really a bad gameplay decision, because that makes it way easier to be caught. The thing is, I've never read any single publication taking those statistics and trying to dive into it and say, okay, I get the information, now what does it tell me? How can we actually utilize that? Because companies do that. They look at the data, they try to see patterns and try to improve things. Obviously, within a development cycle, that's difficult and it's costly, but they do it at least post-mortem and trying to become better in the next cycle, the next product. And academia sits on the sidelines, is basically whining about the fact that we are not getting open access to everything, and I can understand it because it's vital information in many, many points. But then at least use the stuff that's out there. We have strategy guides, we have art books. And yes, not for everyone, unfortunately. I would love to see way more art books because those artists are some of the best artists we have on the market, and they create new worlds, new visions. And it's just a shame that they create all this content and it's never seen publicly because nobody wanted to print it. But then at least when it's printed, we should have a decency to acknowledge it and quote them and see that it is out there. Because if other people, if young scholars, people who are interested in maybe going that route, going academia, if they have at least 1 or 2 classes about good academic research, they are laughing at us for a very good reason, because just a fraction has the tools that is necessary to make proper science. Feasible science, science that can hold the teeth of time and hold being contested. And that's the thing where I personally get really, really aggravated that we can talk all day long. But the point is, it depends not on us individually alone, but on us as a community. And the community needs to change and acknowledge certain things.
Maybe now we can get some questions from the publics. Do you guys have any questions to our lecturers? Paweł?
Okay, so what should I ask you? The first question then I would be, because you talked a lot about academia, and I would, if I can, would like to also go back to the philosophy part. Butchering Heidegger a little bit, he talked about art, that art is thing that can show truth in the world, that you can have this, he was talking about a painting of peasant shoes, and that the shoes actually showed the truth about the world. So without going for the truth part because it's problematic, but without, let's say, showing something about the world, what can the games show that the other media cannot? Are the games another perspective that is different but not really adding something, or do they have something that the other media cannot show this truth, but the games can?
That's a very good question, actually. I think that video games, contrary to other media and using Heideggerian perspective, allow for inhabitation. You can actually inhabit a space in a video game, and you can actually acclimatize there, make it your own, and return to it as if it were your home. That's a very uncommon thing in other media, although it may happen in literature, but on a far less degree. Basically, when we return to the story world of a book, we return to a very familiar environment, and we cannot extend it by any means. We can write fan fiction, of course, but that's slightly different. And when we return to our household built in Skyrim, or to our dojo in Warframe, or to our train in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and so on and so forth, or to our winery, I should mention that because of the Polish context, Corvo Bianco in Toussaint, in The Witcher 3. These are different returns. I think that we can easily say that we are returning to our second home, place in the virtual space, one that we know, love, and relate to, one we can be fond of, one we could look forward to inhabiting, and so on and so forth. In case of literature, we constantly keep getting back to some other story, and that's a difference. It's not our story per se. It's our story in, let's say, Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutics perspective, so we can narrate our own story by interrelating with other characters, but it will still be their word. And that's the problem. Of course, fantasy and science fictional books, fantasy books, fantastic books in general, are trying to fool us, and they are placing, for instance, maps and dictionaries and so on and so forth. But these are the very same tools that may accompany also a video game or a movie. So that's different. So speaking media-wise, I do think that this level of inhabitation, and by also any immense immersion, is very high because of this freedom. And I do not think that movies or TV series or books or comic books can encompass it in such a way a video game can, especially when we add to that this mobbing capacity, which changes things on an entirely different level.
But actually, that was the point I was thinking about. So if you take Roger Caillois, and how he was thinking about games. I think one really important part is the social aspect to it, and the fact that you have the agon, and the agon means the tournament, the fight, basically, and the competition, yes. And the important thing about this is you can know a person your entire lifetime, but you will truly know him in the first time you play with him Mario Kart 8. My God, friendships are destroyed there. I tell you, man. I tell you. Actually, basically every Nintendo game, if I think about it now. And the thing is now, what's happening there? People show the true self. They stop showing their outer persona. They show what they care about. Do they care about winning? Do they care about supporting others? Do they care about making other people comfortable even if they are better? And why? Because playing is inherently human. It's inherently something that is so deeply ingrained into us that we are not used to pretend something else. We pretend what is natural to us. So if you look at the statistics of many video games, you'll see that many people play first as a paragon, which is actually a good thing because that means people think positive values like honor and reliability and honesty are good. Now the question is, does that mean that the renegades are altogether psychopaths and we should watch them? Different question. But theoretically you could say, well, then they at least play what they aren't in real life and they can't live out, so they do it there. So to answer your question, this agon is actually really great because no other medium can do that. Okay, obviously other types of games, but digital games make it very easy, very accessible. People from all around the world can play together and scream at each other and like each other and form friendships, and sometimes they marry each other after meeting at World of Warcraft, which is amazing. And this is specifically different. If two people read Lord of the Rings at two different parts of the world, as long as they do not use a second medium, they will never meet each other. They will never have the same connection. They may have the same ideas, but books do not connect. People connect with each other through other means. Games can do that directly. This is a great advantage. And there's a second aspect to it. You said, what can games deliver us? And then we're back to rhetoric. The point is, if we look, for example, at, basically every war game, every simulation, it makes visible and playable what happened in the past and happens in the present. So if I play Hearts of Iron, and I play Germany, and I overthrow it to make it democratic and prevent the Axis from actually rising, what does it tell me? It tells me that there might have been a possibility. It teaches me that we are not predetermined. And okay, I know philosophy is a bit tricky in that question, but the game makes the argument, well, it could have been different. There could have been a different history. And so games create spaces of infinite possibility. Unless I start interacting with them, I will never know it, but if I do, I learn something about the immense amount of possibilities given to us. And books can't do that. Okay, a bit maybe with choose your own adventure books, but very, very linear. And games live on procedurality and this slight degrees of difference they can create. Potentially.
As a graduate of philology, I must add one thing, that despite all the disadvantage of books, we must admit that in video games we often encounter books which can be read, which means that there is a certain degree of usability, let's say. It's easier, for instance, to present lore. It's easier to familiarize the player with mythology than to let him, I don't know, encounter with goddess who lived in the past of the story world. That's illogical. So I think that what is different here is the function. Literature within video game worlds functions differently, but is preserving its, as Murray would say, encyclopedic capacity. It's the highest, unquestionably. Although the video game surpasses literature in a way that a video game can include a book, whereas a book cannot include a video game. That's this difference, and this difference, I think, it's not in the medium, but it's in the nature of the world that is created. It's a virtual world, so it's an entirely different frontier, and that the way that we have video games as, let's say, windows that allow us for encountering with virtual world doesn't change the matter of medium.
And I think that's really important to stress, that all media, no matter which one, digital or non-digital, whatsoever, they all have a strength and weaknesses, and books will deliver certain insights a game will never deliver. Full stop. Movies can deliver certain experience no other medium can deliver. Full stop. Same applies to games. Games simply have a different thing. I would call procedurality as maybe the major factor into it. Maybe there are some others. But the point is, we are not superior to them. I mean, like, we as video game scholars are not superior to literature theory studies or to movie studies, and that's important to stress. So we deliver a new aspect, not a better one.
And video games allow, in a very high degree, for narrativizing ourselves, so creating the narrative about us as the subject, as the player, as the individual, as the person, which other media cannot. Honestly, we can pretend it's happening in different media, but it's not being realized in stat nascendi. It's just happening in our interpretation, for instance. But it's not happening right now. We cannot create ourselves in a book or in anywhere else. We cannot. Simply in a video game, of course, we can. We can shape a virtual avatar for our resemblance, of course. We can do so if we so desire, but we aren't forced to do so. So this great level of freedom is I think, something that distinguishes video games in comparison to other media. Obviously, I wholeheartedly agree that certain media has their advantages, but this advantage that video game propose is definitely one that bridges all the differences between people, between races, between sexualities, between different worldviews, and so on and so on. That's important. We do not, for instance, need to translate a video game. Even certain video games do not need subtitles. They just happen, and that's incredible because it allows really for instance, for a person from Israel and Palestine to play with each other, and that's absolutely amazing because they do not have to communicate with each other, and yet they are creating a kind of community.
And video games are very useful in developing so-called soft skills, right? There are stories around about people who put in their curriculum vitae, I'm a leader of a guild as a management competence, and some businesses actually think it's a good indication of this kind of competence. So I think literature and written word is very good to learn some theory, but practice is far better learned through simulation, which computer games does best. Okay, so there is maybe another question from the audience. Okay. You, Paweł, had another one. I know that.
Though this would be actually two questions, one for each of you, since I had some things written down for each of you. So to not visible. So to you, Sven, I wanted to ask about this because you said you wanted to hear from a game researcher with a degree in business, and I have to ask whether it really is the need for a business perspective or from a design perspective, because business should not, of course it does affect the overall product, but it should not be, and in many YouTube critics you see that it is not an explanation for some failures in the product, because I know that the game is always a cycle and they repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until it is polished enough to send. But wouldn't a business perspective be dangerous in that regard, that it would try to not look at the game anymore and not look, because the design of the gaming would be a process, and that would bring another interesting side to the story. But business would look from too far, I think, or that's my perspective. That's my perspective, and I would like to hear yours. Why the business exactly? And to you, Krzysztof, I have a question, because you were very upset with Mario's and with Mario's examples. So I wonder whether it's a problem not of using historical examples, but not using modern examples as well, because as far as I can see, if we throw away the Mario, then we are getting blind to the history, to the why certain conventions happened. If we compare stuff, for example, I don't know, civilization to chess, we can perhaps learn something more than just from looking at the newest civilization. So my question would be whether it's the history or the progression.
I would say it the following way. It is complicated. So, yes, in an ideal world, I would love to have a critic that is a philosopher and a game designer. Yes, but the issue is, and I can fully understand it, because game designers are artists, they have visions, they want to create the best possible game. But unfortunately, and Krzysztof explained it perfectly well, we have usually a giant team, and this team needs to make decisions together. That means conflicting interests, conflicting ideas, and very often, in most companies, money is a decisive factor, because you need to acknowledge we have a certain budget, and we can't go over this budget because, well, if it runs out, it runs out, and either we are bankrupt or we can throw it onto the market. So what happens is, if we have critics who take a look at a game, and a very recent example was, I do not know if you've played it, Technomancer. Technomancer is set on Mars, and it's a really decent RPG, and it was all the time compared with Witcher, because it was shortly after it released. And I was sitting there thinking, are you freaking mad? A, way different production times. B, entirely different staff sizes. C, entirely different budget. How the hell do you want to compare two entirely different things? It's like I'm comparing my Mercedes-Benz CLK, which I don't have, but I would like to have, with a Lada. How the hell should I make a reasonable, trustworthy comparison if I pretend both companies are the same? And this is the point. Many journalists, many critics behave as if games just appear. It's magic. And what I call business is a sense of reasonability, how those products are actually produced, what is entailed into it, also how much marketing is involved. Many great games out there will never be discovered. Why? Because they don't have a marketing budget to make people listen to it and play it. And there are great journalists out there who really understand their profession, and they understand it's complex, but so many make criticisms where I personally could just throw one tantrum after another because I hear suddenly, well, look at this. Here it's clipping and that's clipping and there I have a visual problem, and I'm thinking, dude, that's a C bug. Nobody fucking cares at the company if it's clipping there, as long as the game is working, as long as the game itself isn't prevented from being enjoyable. We can freaking live with it as long as we don't have a budget to fix it. It's a wrong prioritization, and I think a business mindset would maybe set things in line a bit more. That's what I meant.
I will start with an anecdote, because I remember going to a film music festival, and I expected Imperial March, Avatar, Pirates of Caribbean, and so on and so forth. Huge titles and great music, and so on and so forth. And of course, I received one piece like Imperial March, and another one was just obsolete, but good from field studies perspectives examples, and of course that could be well framed in a review that would appear later on. So that's what I fear is happening when examples are selected. Usually, people focus on those classical, historical examples that everyone knows are important, of course, but I think that balancing between those, let's say, contemporary video games and historical important video games would be important, although dedicating half of the book to Mario and later on mentioning that, oh, there is also Dishonored, is kind of funny. I remember a book actually about fantasy published in 2013 in Poland, which elaborated on the history of genre, obviously Conan, Tolkien, everyone knows about it, and later on, oh, and there is this postmodernism, and during this time there were several books, of course, the genre steampunk, cyberpunk, and others, but that will be the time for another book to tell. So that's the problem, because
great marketing pitch.
Over focusing on historical examples proves results that are counter to the reader's expectations, because reading a book that is supposed to be a history of fantasy narratives, I suppose that there will be a place equally for Tolkien and Jake Ballard and John Crowley and others. And equally, reading a book about video games that doesn't say history of video games up until 2000 or history of video games excluding AAA titles, I expect all those issues to be addressed. And the problem is one disclaimer on the cover in the introduction would solve a problem. I will be focusing on all those titles that are important from the historical perspective, those that, for instance, launched dedicated consoles or platforms and so on and so forth, those that were important from the perspective of the whole industrial revolution. That's obvious. But if someone, and usually those books are merchandised in a way to resemble that it is an entire and complete history of the video gaming industry and video game interpretation and critic and everything, it's causing confusion. And that was also my case, that whenever I picked up a book that was recommended by either Yule or Perron or Valve or Asset, they focus on a very limited range of generally speaking, strange video games or historical video games or video games that are easily illustrated, as I said before, and avoiding those titles that are labeled usually mainstream in video gaming criticism, and not acknowledging the fact that difficult topics and difficult problems are best exemplified on the most known examples, and those examples that we all can relate to, and thereby better understand the subject. Usually with students I pick up examples from popular culture to their either dismiss or enthusiasm, because I know that studying theory of literature on the example of Honoré de Balzac may not be entertaining and may actually distract from the subject. So that's maybe the issue, but I wholeheartedly agree that we should address both historically important video games and those that are contemporary and popular and so on and so forth. Because now we have a paradoxical situation that looking for papers or articles about let's say, Assassin's Creed is hard, actually, because we can't find those. There are case studies, but case studies do not solve any problem. They do not pose theoretical questions, and they, honestly, they can't be quoted. I never know how to quote a case study, but to say, yes, there was a paper on Assassin's Creed Revelation, okay, it was, and nothing else, because that was a case study, an interpretation. But I would love to quote a certain research paper that deals with, for instance, the problem of the genre that was established by Assassin's Creed, and later on the moves that are performed by Ezio Auditore and other assassins are actually mimicked in other video games, like Shadow of Mordor. The mechanics of movement in Shadow of Mordor is mirrored after Assassin's Creed, and it's perfectly fine, but it should be addressed. And my fear is that it's not as widely addressed as it should be.
Sven, do you want to add something?
No, actually not, but the last thing you just mentioned is interesting, because the reversal is also an interesting problematic part. So yes, we have an awful lot of academics just focusing on specific, primarily older games, but then we have journalists almost, and that basically mirrors what I said earlier, focus on one game only, and suddenly you have 10,000 clones of X, Y, and Z. Right now, everything is a Bloodborne clone. And yes, certainly they share certain aspects, but it's also not healthy, because, for example, Nier was recently released, and I personally played it, and I had the impression, well, it's done by the guys from Ninja Gaiden. And it feels like a Ninja Gaiden game with certain Bloodborne-esque features. But the permanent comparison with Bloodborne is doing nobody a favor. Doesn't do it a favor for customers, because they expect a different type of game and might be disappointed. The creators are not been happy with it, most likely, because they will always be just the second one, just a clone. They are not independent, they are not new. And yeah, certainly there are certain things, but in that case, I can say every game I ever known is a clone of Pong, because Pong is the first game I can think of where you have a joystick and somehow control something. That's just a stupid oversimplification of our world, and it's misfortunate because it doesn't take the huge artistic vision and effort by the individual teams or the one singular person out there serious. It just wants to make it super easy to comprehend. But pardon, but we are a bit more than just a one-page proposal. We're actually an entire 10,000 book encyclopedia of creators, makers, marketers, and content.
I think what you just said is great and best sum up I can think of. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up because our time is almost up. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I think we could continue for an hours, and it probably is needed discussion, but thank you a lot.